Many Jews today feel the need for a Jewish renaissance. People are searching for a more vital and authentic mode of Jewish expression, and more than ever we need to shift not only physically but spiritually out of exile mode. This is Torah Nation TV from Jerusalem, and we are speaking with the head of Machon Shilo, Rabbi David Bar-Hayim. Shalom, Rabbi Bar-Hayim.
Shalom.
How does one choose which Nusach Tfilla to daven?
Most people, for obvious reasons, daven the Nusach to which they are used. In other words, the Nusach which they grew up with in school or in the shul, what they heard at home, and that's how most people choose, so to speak. In other words, they don't really choose, and that's okay. There's nothing wrong with that. It's also true that some poskim claim that a person is required halachically to follow the Nusach of the Tfilla, the precise rite of prayer, of Jewish prayer book used by his ancestors, his or her ancestors. This claim is incorrect. Some poskim who used this, who wished to make this claim, used the Yerushalmi, supposedly, that a quote from the Talmud Yerushalmi at the end of the 3rd chapter of Masechet Eruvin, to back up this claim, but in fact, upon examination, one discovers that those words, those lines in the Talmud Yerushalmi in Eruvin are being misquoted by some of the poskim, apparently because they simply didn't have before them an accurate version, or any version perhaps, of the Talmud Yerushalmi, and they were quoting the material second and third hand, and the information became somewhat garbled, and also based on an incorrect interpretation of the statement of the Talmud Yerushalmi. We won't go into what it does actually say there, but it has nothing to do with Tefillah. So the fact is that a person is not required necessarily to follow the Nusach of Tefillah that his forebears used, although of course one may do so.
Where do the different Nushaoth come from?
That is a very good question, because we are told by Hazal, the sages of the Mishnah and the Talmud. This appears, for example, in the Talmud Bavli in Berachot Daf Lamed, that all the essential tefilloth and berachot that we have, such as the Shmona Esrei, such as Kiddush and Havdalah and the like, were instituted by Anshe Knesset HaGadolah, the men of the Great Assembly, which takes us back to a period of time about 2,500 years ago. Now, one could ask oneself the question, and one should ask oneself the question, what exactly was the Nusach of Tefillah that was instituted by those Chachamim 2,500 years ago? If we look around today, the different Sidurim, the different Minhagim that we have, one can open a Sidur, let's say Nusach Ashkenaz, and compare it to a Sidur Nusach Sfaradim, Idot HaMizrah, and compare both of those to a Nusach of the Temanim, and one finds that although the Shmona Esrei in all cases is similar in many ways, the essential format is entirely the same, all based on the 19 Baracha, 19 blessing format that the Talmud Bavli discusses, but there also are some differences, not even always insignificant differences. So if one asks the question, so where's the original? What was the original Nusach that Anshe Knesset HaGadolah wrote down? There are two simple answers to that question. A, one could claim that it was never written down, there was never any fixed Nusach to begin with, and B, one could say that if there was such a Nusach once upon a time, that clearly we have lost that Nusach.
Can the Rabbi please elaborate?
Certainly. The first point is that let's assume that there was a fixed Nusach. In other words, that the Hachamim and Anshe Knesset HaGadolah actually formulated word for word the Nusach of, for example, the Shmona Esrei. If that's the case, and we find today that we have, for argument's sake, if we take into account Nusach Ashkenaz, Sfarad, Temanim, we look at the more ancient Nushaoth of the Geonim, like Rav Sa'adya Gaon, Rav Amram Gaon, the Rambam and Rashi, etc., you could easily arrive at 10 different versions of the Shmona Esrei. Although, again, they're all very similar and very close. The basic format, in other words, the number of barachot, the order of those barachot, the essential themes covered by each baracha, these certainly are universal. They exist and in a very similar way in all those Nushaoth, and yet there are differences in the wordings, in the length, etc. So if one asks oneself which of these 10 Nushaoth, shall we say, is the original, so to speak, the obvious answer is that no one could say. No one has any idea which of these Nushaoth, if any, is the original. Perhaps it's also possible that there was some more authentic, more ancient Nusach which once existed, which we no longer have before us, and all the Nushaoth that we do have before us are based on that original, but none of them are a precise reflection of that original Nusach. That is one possibility. And this is, by the way, generally understood and agreed to by all the Hachamim. In other words, one does not find that when the Rambam, for example, brings his Nusach of the Tfilla at the end of Sefer Ahava, in his famous work, the Mishneh Torah, one does not find that he writes that this is the Nusach of Anshe Knesset HaGedolah, and I guarantee this, and therefore you should use this Nusach. He doesn't say that. And neither does Rav Amram Gaon make such a claim for his Nusach, nor does Rav Sa'adya Gaon make such a claim for his Nusach, nor does Rashi or his students make such a claim for their Nusach. In other words, no one makes the claim that they have the original Nusach of Anshe Knesset HaGedolah, word for word and letter for letter, with the exception of one school of thought, that is to say, Hasidei Ashkenaz. This term, Hasidei Ashkenaz, refers to the small school of the Ashkenazi mystics, great Torah scholars and great mystics who lived in the 10th, 11th, 12th, 13th centuries in the general area of Germany, what we call Germany today, the Ashkenaz. People like Rabbi Yehuda Hasid and his Talmid Rabbi Elazar Migramaiza, Rabbi Elazar of Worms, and other great Hachamim of that school, they were convinced, as Rabbi Elazar Migramaiza mentions a number of times in his Perush. We have a commentary of Rabbi Elazar Migramaiza on the entire Sidur, and his Nusach, his almost letter for letter Nusach Ashkenaz that we have today, which proves, by the way, the very long and impressive pedigree that Nusach Ashkenaz can claim for itself. He, in his commentary on the Sidur, he a number of times makes the explicit claim that this Nusach that I'm giving you here, word for word, letter for letter, is exactly the Nusach of Anshe Knesset HaGedolah. And that is also why, because they were convinced of this, that is why they spent a lot of time and energy counting the numbers of words in each baracha, and the number of words in all the Shmona Esrei, for example, and the numbers of letters in each baracha, etc. And they found correlations between the number of words or letters in a certain baracha and a certain pasuk in the Tanakh, etc. And then their whole Perush, the Perush of these Chachamim on the Sidur, people like Rabbi Elazar Migramaiza, Rabbi Shimshon Migramaiza, and others, is based on this way of thinking. They allowed themselves and felt it correct to deal with the Tefillah in such a manner because they were quite sure that their Nusach was the original, the authentic Nusach of Anshe Knesset HaGedolah, literally word for word. But this claim, unfortunately, as nice as it would be to be able to believe it, this claim is entirely without basis, no historical documented basis, nor is it very rational to assume that Dafka, this Nusach, is the one that was instituted by Anshe Knesset HaGedolah. And one could even point out the simple fact that Nusach Ashkenaz of Shmona Esrei, like all the other Nusach of the Shmona Esrei that are commonly in use today, consist of 19 Barachot, whereas Anshe Knesset HaGedolah instituted 18 Barachot. So it is very, very dubious, to say the least, this claim made by Hasidei Ashkenaz, and therefore we can sum up at this point by saying that no one can claim to know which of these Nushaoth is the original, if any of them in fact are the original. So the conclusion must be that we don't have such any original Nusach. The other point which needs to be made, and this is a very important point, is that more likely the correct interpretation and understanding of this matter is that there never was a fixed authentic Nusach that was instituted by Anshe Knesset HaGedolah, word for word, letter for letter. There is no indication of such a Nusach ever having been formulated by Anshe Knesset HaGedolah or any of their followers, their students, the Chachamim of the Mishnah and the Talmud. One would imagine, if this was the case, if there was such a Nusach, one would imagine it would have been recorded for us word for word in the Mishnah or in the Tosefta or in the Talmud, whereas we have no such Nusach anywhere in the writings of Hazal. And the same could be said, by the way, with regards to Birkat HaMazon or Birkot Kriyat Shema, etc. Nowhere do we find a precise Nusach, as pointed out by the Rabbi in his Hidushim to Masechet Barachot, Daf Yud Aleph, and other Rishonim and Aharonim. There was apparently no fixed Nusach word for word that one is required to follow, but rather the Chachamim instituted general rules and configurations for the Tfilla. In other words, with regards to Shmoneh Esrei, the basic format was that there are 18 Barachot, and that these Barachot are to be recited in a certain order, and each Barachah deals with a certain topic or theme, sometimes more than one theme per Barachah, and many of the essential wordings were apparently, if not fixed, at least traditional and known throughout the Jewish world, but there were always apparently also variations, and there was always the possibility of expanding the Nusach, adding more words, using more flowery language, or being more concise, adding Pesukim into the Nusach, or not doing so, etc. And this explains the differences between the Nushaoth that exist. And this is almost without any doubt, a more accurate depiction of the historical reality.
What about Nusach Sfarad and Nusach Chabad?
These two Nushaoth are very recent, they're very new. Both these Nushaoth, Nusach Sfarad and Nusach, the Nusach called Nusach Chabad or Nusach Ha'ari, as Chabad choose to call it, even though it's absolutely clear that the Ari never knew of such a Nusach and did not daven such a Nusach, were put together by certain Hasidic Rabbis in Eastern Europe in the late 18th and early 19th centuries. In the case of the Baal HaTanya, for example, his Nusach, which Chabad uses, he based on a comparison of many different Sidurim, which claimed to represent the Nusach of the Ari. There were huge differences and discrepancies between all those different sources that he had before him, as is well known. And on the basis of Nusach Ashkenaz, he put together this alternate Nusach, which can be seen really as a kind of alternate form or redacted form of Nusach Ashkenaz. And the same is true for Nusach Sfarad, even more obviously so, because Nusach Sfarad essentially is Nusach Ashkenaz with many words added to it. In other words, very little was removed, but many words were added. And it's a very recent invention, and to be frank, Nusach Sfarad is a rather clumsy invention. It is wordy. It sometimes is self-contradictory. Within the same bracha itself, sometimes we hear terms or usages which cannot live together in the same bracha. One example would be the ending of the bracha Shomea Tfilla, where the Nusach of the Ashkenazim was Ki ata shomea tefilat amecha Yisrael b'rahamim, and the Nusach of the Sfaradim was Ki ata shomea tefilat kol peh. And in some versions of Nusach Sfarad, we end up with the Nusach Ki ata shomea tefilat kol peh amecha Yisrael b'rahamim, which essentially is two separate ideas. One, that Hashem hears the prayer of every individual, and the other is that Hashem hears the prayer of Am Yisrael. Not contradictory ideas, but also not identical ideas. and lumping them together in such a fashion obviously does not work, which is why in some versions of Nusach Sfarad that duality was dropped. And there are many such examples. At any rate, we do see clearly that these Nushaoth did not exist more than approximately 220 years ago.
What exactly is Nusach Eretz Yisrael?
Nusach Eretz Yisrael is the Nusach, or the set of Nushaoth that we find both in the many fragments of ancient Sidurim that were found in the Cairo Geniza. It is well known that the Cairo Geniza was found in the attic above a shul, a synagogue in Cairo, in the old ancient city of Cairo, Fustat, where for centuries they had kept untouched ancient manuscripts that had simply fallen apart, old Sidurim, etc., many kinds of texts and documents that were placed in the Geniza and left untouched for many centuries. And in that Geniza, in those ancient materials, some of them dating back to as early as the 9th and 10th centuries, we find a wealth of information, including many Sidurim or parts of Sidurim, which present to us a Nushaoth Tfilla, which till the finding of that Geniza were more or less unknown. More or less unknown in the sense that there was no living community of Jews in the world who were still using that Nusach, except for the Jews in that particular synagogue in Cairo, who till very recent times did maintain that Nusach of Tfilla, which they inherited from their forefathers who had emigrated to Egypt from Eretz Yisrael. We also have many snippets of the Tfilla and certain barachot, such as Birkot Kriyas Shema, etc., in some of the works of Hazal, the Midrashei Halacha and Agada, and the Talmud Yerushalmi, all of which stem from Eretz Yisrael. And by putting together all these sources, we can recreate and reconstitute an accurate version of the Tefillah as it was known, as it was recited, as it was taught in Eretz Yisrael, going back certainly to the period of the Talmud, if not even before that. And this Nusach was in use in Eretz Yisrael without a doubt, as we see, as it is quoted in the Talmud Yerushalmi and Midrashei Halacha and Agada of Hazal. It was in use in Eretz Yisrael and surrounding countries during the time of the Geonim, and even well into the Middle Ages. As a result, however, of the Crusades, the Crusaders invaded Eretz Yisrael, as is well known, at the end of the 11th century. And from that time on, the Jewish communities of Eretz Yisrael began to dwindle and eventually disappear. And that reality was unfortunately dealt more or less a death blow. But today we are able, with all the sources at our disposal, we are able to reconstruct a very accurate picture of Nusach Eretz Yisrael, which was a Nusach which existed side by side with the Nusach of the Tefillah, which existed in Bavel, in Babylon, in ancient times, in the time of the Mishnah, the time of the Talmud, in the time of the Geonim. And that Nusach of Bavel was the archetype which resulted in all the Nushaoth with which we are familiar today, whether it be Ashkenazim, Sfaradim, Temanim. All those Nushaoth are based on the Bavli prototype, whereas the Nusach of Eretz Yisrael was sidelined for historical reasons for a long time. And today we are able, Baruch Hashem, to revive it and bring it back to life.
Can a person choose to change from one Nusach Tefillah to another?
Yes, absolutely so. There is no halachic requirement that a person sticks to only one Nusach. This is what most people do for obvious reasons, because it's easier to continue with a certain Nusach that you are used to, and to use the same Nusach day in, day out, because it's a matter, something which is easy and second nature. But if a person wishes to switch Nusach even on daily basis. On Sunday to daven Nusach Sfaradim, and Monday Nusach of the Ashkenazim, and on Tuesday the Nusach of the Temanim, etc. That is definitely mutar, and the claim that it is halachically required that a person stick to one Nusach or follow a particular Nusach of his forefathers is untrue. As we've mentioned, there is a teshuvah written by the Maharashtam, Rabbi Shmuel B'Dimodina, in the 16th century. He was asked by some Ashkenazi Jews who came to Turkey whether they were required to continue davening the Nusach of the Ashkenazim, which they had inherited, to which they were used, and or whether they could join one of the communities of the Sfaradim in Turkey and daven their Nusach. And he says to them, no, you may join any of the existing communities and you may daven the Nusach of the Sfaradim. And the claim that a person has to follow the minhagim of his forefathers, he says, is true, but only in certain circumstances and with regards to certain kinds of minhagim. That is to say, minhagim which pertain to forbidding something which is mutar for reasons of a siyag, of building a fence around the Torah. Certain minhagim of that type are obligatory and binding on the descendants of those people, but the question of which nusach to daven is not such a question. It's not more mutar or more asur to daven nusach Ashkenaz as opposed to nusach of the Temanim, and it's not more mutar or asur to daven the nusach of Eretz Yisrael as opposed to the nusach of Bavel. So nusach Tfilla is really an open question, and every person can decide for himself or herself that which appeals to them, that which sits well with them, for whatever reason or set of reasons that may appeal to that person.
Thank you, Rabbi Bar-Hayim. We would like to encourage our viewers to share these videos with friends and send in your responses. We would also like to suggest the following opportunity to our viewers. If you identify with Rabbi Bar-Hayim's message and would like to sponsor or dedicate a video interview with the Rabbi in honor or memory of a loved one, if you would like to obtain Birkon Nusach Eretz Yisrael or invite the Rabbi for a speaking engagement, please email us at office@machonshilo.org.